I was the translator. That needs to be understood, because it shapes everything that came after. I wasn't the senior envoy. I wasn't the military liaison. I didn't carry credentials from the Joint Command, or from any Senate floor back home. I carried a lexicon, 9,000 root forms across 14 species languages, loaded into a cortical buffer behind my right ear, updated twice daily by a team on the Garuda station relay. My job was to listen and render, to make sure every word that crossed the chamber floor arrived intact on our side. At the ratification of what they called the Vitharan Containment Accord, I had nothing to do. The Directorate's chamber was vast, circular, and bright. A tiered amphitheater cut from pale stone, open at the crown to a glass dome 200 meters across. Daylight fell through it in fat, warm columns. Holographic overlays floated along the inner ring, projecting clause text in 12 scripts simultaneously. The seats rose in concentric arcs, packed with delegates from every signatory species. The Asari, with their long gray faces folded into permanent expressions of judicial patience. The Dreth, compact and sharp-eyed, their robes heavy with trade insignia. A half-dozen Olvathi legal scholars, whose translucent membranes flickered as they parsed subclauses faster than any of us could read. There were 411 delegates in the chamber that day. On our side, there were 3. Senior Envoy Calloway, her military attaché Lieutenant Commander Oren, and me. Calloway sat at the narrow human bench at the bottom of the well. Her hands were flat on the surface. She hadn't spoken since we entered the chamber 40 minutes earlier. The terms were not kind. They weren't designed to be. The Asari had drafted them over 9 months, with input from every major voting bloc, and the intent was straightforward: to cap humanity's growth at its current size and keep it there permanently. The Directorate had decided we were expanding too fast, trading too aggressively, building too quietly, and this accord was their answer. Article 9 restricted Earth's fleet tonnage to a fixed ceiling, roughly 1/3 of what we currently operated. Article 14 froze human expansion at the boundary of the Callaway Line, a cordon the Directorate had drawn around our 17 colony systems without consulting us. Article 22 revoked Earth's observer status on the Trade Caucus. Article 31 required annual inspections of all human shipyards by Directorate auditors. There were 44 articles in total. Each one tightened the frame. The Asari delegate who read the clauses aloud did so with a voice that was smooth and unhurried. Each article landed in the chamber like a stone dropped into still water. The chamber waited for ripples. None came. I watched Calloway. Her expression didn't shift. Oren's jaw was set, but he didn't move. I sat with my hands in my lap, my buffer active, the lexicon running, and no words to process. Our delegation had been instructed before we left the Garuda relay: listen to everything, respond to nothing. When the reading was complete, the Directorate's presiding officer, an Asari named Tual Orath, turned to our bench and extended the formal invitation to reply. Calloway looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she picked up the stylus, signed the last page of the accord, set the stylus down, and folded her hands. That was it. No speech, no objection, no counter-proposal. The chamber held its breath, waiting for the protest that defines every ratification in Directorate memory. Every species fights the terms. Every species haggles. That's how the system works. The initial terms are a ceiling, and the real negotiation happens in the pushback. We didn't push back. I translated nothing. Calloway signed, and the 3 of us sat in silence while 411 delegates tried to understand what compliance without resistance meant. I could feel it in the room, the weight of a system that runs on friction, suddenly encountering none. The Dreth trade delegates exchanged glances. 2 Olvathi scholars let their membranes go still, which I'd never seen before. The chamber had prepared for a negotiation. It had not prepared for agreement. Tual Orath's long face shifted, a faint contraction of the lower membrane that in Asari body language registers confusion bordering on alarm. He asked whether the human delegation wished to have the terms reviewed. Calloway shook her head once. The session was gavelled closed 11 minutes ahead of schedule. We walked out through the center aisle while the tiers watched us go. Not one delegate spoke. We left no document on the table, no symbol, no protest. Just the signed accord and 3 empty chairs. That was 19 years ago. I was recalled to the Directorate chamber last month. Not as a translator, my cortical buffer has been decommissioned for 6 years, but as a witness. The Directorate's Compliance Commission had completed what they called a comprehensive structural audit of human activity under the Containment Accord, and they wanted someone from the original signing delegation to answer questions. Calloway is retired. Orrin died in a station fire 8 years ago. I was what they had left. I'd spent the intervening years in linguistic research, archival work on the Asari diplomatic lexicon mostly, cataloging the body language register that they use in closed-session deliberations. Quiet work. The kind that teaches you to read a room by watching skin. The chamber looked the same. The pale stone, the glass dome, the warm daylight falling through in columns. The tiers were less full, 300 delegates instead of 400, because 2 signatory species had withdrawn from the Directorate since I'd last been there. The Asari were still presiding. Tual Orath was still alive, though older. The gray of his face deeper, the membrane slower. He read the audit findings aloud. His voice was no longer smooth. It caught on the numbers. Earth's fleet tonnage was exactly at the ceiling. Not a kilogram over, but the composition had changed completely. Where we'd once operated heavy cruisers and patrol frigates, the current fleet consisted entirely of a new class. Lighter, faster, built around a drive architecture the treaty had never anticipated, because it hadn't existed when the terms were written. A single one of our corvettes could outrun anything the Directorate fielded. The treaty said nothing about speed. The Calloway line was intact. We hadn't crossed it. But the 17 colony systems inside that boundary had been industrialized to a degree the Audit Commission described as structurally unprecedented. Our manufacturing output inside the cordon exceeded the Directorate's total output across 400 systems. The boundary had become irrelevant, not because we'd broken it, but because everything we needed was already inside it. Our observer status on the Trade Caucus had been revoked, as prescribed, so we'd built our own network. Bilateral agreements with 41 species who were not Directorate members, many of whom had left the Directorate specifically to trade with us. The Audit Commission's report noted, with visible discomfort, that the non-Directorate trade corridor now carried more volume than the Directorate's own internal market. The annual shipyard inspections had continued without interruption. Every audit had come back clean. Every facility was within specification. The inspectors had filed compliant reports for 19 consecutive years. But the Commission had gone back and reviewed those reports, and discovered that every shipyard the inspectors visited was a civilian yard. Licensed, registered, fully legal. The military yards, which the treaty had never specifically named as subject to inspection, had never been visited. No one had asked to see them. The treaty didn't require it. No one had thought to look. Tual Orath set the report down. The chamber was silent in a way I recognized. Not the silence of composure, the way our bench had been silent 19 years ago, but the silence of a body that has just understood the shape of its own error. Through the dome, the daylight was the same color it had been the first time, but now there were shapes in the sky that hadn't been there before. Long, dark silhouettes holding formation at the edge of the atmosphere, unhurried, visible to every tier. The delegates on the upper arcs noticed them first. I watched the recognition move down the rows like a slow wave, face after face, tilting upward, membranes contracting, robes shifting. Tual Orath asked me whether the human delegation had been aware, at the time of signing, that the accord contained structural gaps of this nature. I sat with my hands in my lap, the way I had 19 years ago. The same bench, the same posture. The lexicon was gone, but I wouldn't have needed it. His question didn't require translation. It required an answer I was never going to give. The silence held. It held the way it had held the first time, not empty, not defiant, just patient. The silence of something that had already finished growing while the room was still reading the old measurements. Tuol Orath's membrane contracted, the same expression as before. I'd learned the Asari classification for it in the years since, during my work with their linguistic archives. It isn't confusion. It was never confusion. The closest translation is the grief of discovering that the thing you built to protect yourself is the thing that made you irrelevant. I sat still. The fleet held position through the glass. The chamber understood, finally, what it had been looking at for 19 years. Compliance.